everyone. This is still Diana Kowarski. Thank you for being at the Soft Skills Salon podcast, where it is that we say conversation is the currency of communication. So let's have a conversation. Today, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Lorelle Luciuk, who has been a member of Ontario's policing community for over 27 years and is currently in the role of a platoon staff sergeant leading 20 patrol officers. Lorelle has enjoyed a career of diverse and interesting experiences, including 7 years dedicated to the training and education of her police service members. Lorelle has successfully led several large organizational projects, which she found to be challenging, exhilarating, and rewarding. An enthusiastic forever learner, Lorelle has 2 undergraduate degrees, a college diploma in management studies, a master's certificate in municipal management, certificates in management, communication studies, and project management, and certificates in lean management and Lean Six Sigma. As well as all of this, I am delighted that Lorelle is here because she has some fantastic experiences that I know she's going to share, and we haven't had a chance to connect in a while. Hello, Lorelle.
Hello, Diana, and thank you so much for including me in your podcast.
Not at all. I'm delighted. So you have agreed to spend some time with me. I'm thrilled. And you did the pre-work selecting some questions from our Soft Skills Salon Impact Questionnaire, the first of which is our number 5, a favorite of mine. Number 5 reads, where have you seen or experienced empathy in your career? What comes to mind?
This question is like almost an historical question for me for policing because having been around for a little bit, I've seen no empathy in policing, especially in dealing with the public, and to the point of today where mental health is so important and empathy is a common practice in policing. In policing itself, communications and policing, there's 2 aspects to it, really, what's going on inside the organization and how we are outside the organization. And it is... we are all about people. Everything that we do is about people. So early in my career when I started, and it was very traditional policing, empathy was not a topic of conversation. It was not an expectation. It was still very military based, very transactional with people. And then as we grew as a service and as policing grew, I think sympathy kind of made its way into policing communications, which we learned, not shortly thereafter, but in time we learned that sympathy is not the right approach. Right. Because you lose your perspective, you become overly engaged in some very significantly emotional things, which is not healthy for that police officer and for the policing community. Then we learned about empathy and what empathy is and how you might not be the, you can put yourself in that other person's shoes, right? Without becoming absorbed by the emotions of those people and losing yourself. So you maintain your greater perspective, which is good for the person that you're having that communications with, and it's good for the person that's the listener. So mental health has been a thread through policing in Ontario for probably the last 10 years with really good effort. And mental health education tells us that empathetic approach is key. And what I've seen in policing organizations is now not only it's commonplace, but it's expected. And we see that in how we deal with our people now too. So there's lots of very specific examples I can give about that. But my interest in that question is how policing has grown to understand and engage in empathy as an important skill and an important aspect of communication. And it helps people be, to understand police officers a little bit better too, and to humanize them. Right. So there's benefits in that way as well. I find as a leader that people expect me to be empathetic, but they also expect it to be genuine. And if I'm not genuine, it's obvious. So I love that question.
There's a lot in there, Lorelle. I've got a couple of notes I'd like to piggyback on, if I may. So, what I heard as a theme early on in that great answer was that in policing, to your experience, I understood that perhaps mental health has evolved in a two-pronged approach that perhaps is parallel, that there's parallel in the two approaches, being mental health of, well, the policing community themselves, as well as mental health that is in and amongst that people whom you serve in the community. So those are two very different, I want to say aspects of, but they're also very different ways of trying to build empathy when you have the community of policing and how complex and originally military inspired. And then also at the same time, having our communities at large recognize and provide more of a inclusion around mental health challenges that perhaps were there previously that we just had no identification for, or that we had limited understanding for at a community level. Is that in line, those two areas?
Yes, absolutely. And to further that, the empathy that we demonstrate with the public is more instantaneous, but the empathy that we demonstrate inside our organization is built in layers. So to explain it would be, it could be a one-off encounter with somebody where you immediately have to express empathy to a stranger, versus in our organization where you're known and you have history and background, and that empathy becomes part of the layers of who you are. Very different. But still, you build on that skill by both of those examples.
Fair enough. And certainly in your bio, it mentions that you are a leader in the work that you do right now. And I know you've had multiple leadership roles. And being an empathetic leader, then, would that be a characteristic that you would be comfortable placing on yourself?
Absolutely. I think it's paramount in the role that I'm in. And I encourage my colleagues to demonstrate the same thing. It's that genuine caring about people that will, it creates loyalty, it creates better relationships. And right now, to be frank, it encourages people to come to work. If they have that connection with their leadership, and they know that that there's truth in that relationship, they're more likely to come to work, right?
Yeah, I'm reminded of an acronym, and I know we all have so many acronyms throwing around. However, there's an acronym that I learned from the world of psychotherapy that's SEUS, SEUS. And it's one of the ideas for psychotherapists to care while providing, of course, services to anyone who procures their services. And SEUS stands for, I'm almost 100% certain I'm correct on this. It stands for safe, effective use of self.
I love that. And that is completely applicable to what police do on a daily basis. I'm writing it down, Diana.
Oh, good.
That will pop up again with me in the future. But I love that, because there's a connection there between those roles, be it psychotherapy or police. Like police are, ground level, daily psychotherapists in short bits and pieces when we're dealing with the public.
100%.
But inside the organization, it's a more developed portion, right? So I absolutely think that that's key to what we do.
And the empathy there, I think also, if we extend it, right, there's inter-colleague amongst the police community, there's policing to the public, and then I think SEUS as an acronym also brings in this third dimension of self-care, and being aware, and perhaps not necessarily always being skilled at being empathetic with oneself. I know I certainly can be challenged in that regard, but it's very clear that if I'm not okay, no matter what the service I provide, that the service I provide will not be optimized for the service recipient, be that a person who has, allegedly been involved in a, illegal situation, or if they've been the victim of a circumstance. Or so. Do you think that that's the third part of this, is officers and the members of the policing community figuring out how to perhaps be kinder to themselves?
Absolutely. And that's that mental health thread that goes outside our service and comes inside our service. I'd also add perhaps a fourth dimension being organizational empathy. So from the, the senior leadership of the organization and what that looks like and how it influences the entire organization. So it's one of those things that if the ground level's practicing it, but the rest aren't, it becomes a harder skill to continue use, and it doesn't develop to the level that it should be, right?
Absolutely. And it's a great segue to actually your chosen question number 7, if we could leap there together, because
Sure.
Number 7 discusses, or asks you to discuss, what does success leading others look like to you? And you've already given me a little bit of insight from that organizational perspective. However, I'd be interested, with almost 3 decades on the job in policing, there's a lot of mysticism and a lot of misinformation. And I'm also remarkably convinced that it's getting better and that there is some actual information about what policing is like. Yet we don't hear a lot about how leadership works other than that officer who might be facing someone on the street. So there's someone who that officer reports into, right? There's a whole chain there. So what has your experience been in terms of leading others?
So my chain right now, this just so that it's understood, is that I have officers that are patrol officers that report to sergeants, and I'm the next level of reporting beyond those sergeants. So I have a platoon of roughly 20 very fine people that work hard every day. And my influence is them. And my next influence is the next level up, which is my inspector that runs our division. So from the chair that I sit in, and this is an odd thing in communication, in the communication world, is that my success for me is that my people are safe. So, and part of that is how they can communicate safely in very dangerous situations or very volatile situations. So we spend a lot of time ensuring that we recognize that and we behave in a way that we can secure our safety as best that we can. Communication is a huge part of that. You can get yourself into trouble. You can get yourself out of trouble. There can be a couple words that can save your bacon. And then there's a couple words that could put your bacon in the fryer, right? Mm-hmm. Other than the safety component, which is always foremost in my mind, for me, the success in leading others is that my people feel that they can grow and develop in a dignified and respectful manner, and that they can move on to wherever they want to go in policing. So unfortunately for me, success is my people leaving me, right? But they have to experience enough, because the world of policing is huge, and there's so many facets and intricacies of places that you don't really understand unless you're exposed to them. So I provide them with exposure, I provide them with opportunity, and then they develop themselves to be able to leave and go and do what they prefer. And to me, that's successful leadership, that they've found something that they love, they've been supported to get there, they've demonstrated that they're ready for it, and away they go.
And with all of that, while you still have them before you develop them into moving elsewhere if they so desire, can I ask, this era that we're in, and I'm at a loss right now, so if you can correct me, Lorelle, I want to say post-COVID, and I know that that's just not correct. However, this COVID-inspired era, as we crawl out of it, I can't even begin to claim to understand the impact COVID must have had on your staff or the work that you do in regards to safety. And I know when you referred to safety, to be clear, you weren't exclusively talking about physical safety. I know that there were other dimensions. However, I'll ask you to go back, if you don't mind. how did COVID and its unknownness for a while have an influence on how you were leading or how your staff was leading themselves in the community?
I like post-COVID, so I'll be with you on that one for sure.
Right.
It was a big challenge because it totally changed the way that we police, and all of our people had their own each individual personal issues going on with dealing with what their beliefs were, huge things, what their beliefs were, what the dangers that they felt that they could be bringing home to their families were.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of just open dialogue, like constant conversations. My people know that if there's anything personal that they want to come and talk to me about, that let's have those conversations. So let's work through it together. How could we modify things to be better for them? Like our service changed. Like, all the officers were in cars by themselves. So there were no partnered cars. There were efforts made to have like the PPE that went out was extraordinary. But those things kind of created, for people that didn't feel that they had safety issues related to COVID, because we were planting all of these safety mechanisms on them, it kind of opened it up to some people that weren't actually feeling that. So I dealt with it individually. Right. We parade. So at the beginning of every shift, everybody gathers together. We had conversations. You know, some of them were heated. You know, there were some heated ones because people had very particular views. And this is over a long period of time as well, right?
Yeah, I understand. A few
yeah.
years. It's amazing that this COVID era has been a few years of adjustment. And for some industries, there's a lot of ease of labeling in terms of going to a hybrid model, for example. I assume there's no such concept in policing, right?
No.
Right. That doesn't jive with the policing world at all. However, I am very interested to know how people felt and what you were able to hear about not being partnered in cars, because that relationship, I understand from conversations you and I have had in the past, that partner relationship is a remarkably important one on the job in communities. So as a result of COVID, you now had people going out on their own. Is that right? Did I understand you right?
Yes, and some of them were brand new police officers that, that it was a challenge to them, and that learning experience of partnering with other officers that have experience, it took a different dimension. So my particular platoon that I have are, high responders, solid workers. They back each other up all the time. So even if they weren't in the cars together, they found a way to be community and to have those kind of conversations. And again, with the parades and the conversations that happen in and around the shifts, it was still very difficult. And for some people, though, riding alone was the solution to be able to come to work, right? They have elderly parents at home. They have young children. Yep. We really didn't know in the first year what we were dealing with. So we tried to make it as safe as possible for people. And honestly, Diana, like if I had somebody that just said, mentally, I can't be at work today, then you stay home. Then you stay home and you take care of you so that you can come back tomorrow and be whole, right? Like that's just, and for those people, I would gladly go to bat for them at any point in time, because we can't have those expectations of our people at all. But I can tell you today, like we've rebounded. Like there's been a great rebound. Those earlier methods that we had to make things safer for people have been pulled away. We have no protocols anymore. Sick is sick, right? So the encouragement is, if you're not feeling well, stay home, or mask. That's still completely acceptable, is to come and be masked. And our interactions with the public, I think, have shown that kind of return to normal as well. That there's far less expectation, that there's distance, and those uncomfortable periods, I think, are finding their way into history now. Hopefully.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so the one piece that I've missed asking you for some clarification on is, you use the word parades. You have parades.
Oh.
And I don't know if people know what you mean by parades.
Yeah, sorry, it's
So
jargon, isn't it?
it's a good one. I think I get it. But what are the police parades?
Well, and I don't know why we use that word. I mean, it's comes from the military where for your shift or for your duties, everybody collects together and you find out what your roles are for that shift. You get information, you get education. It's the start of every shift, and it's we call it parade. There's no balloons. There's no circus animals.
No firecrackers.
No.
However, no matter what name it goes by, and in some industries that might be a scrum, right? You do that Lean Six Sigma world, which I'm also very interested in and on the outskirts of. So the idea of a scrum, or basically figuring out what is happening here and it being overt with clear expectations. And I'm actually a real proponent for certain aspects of some of how different militaries have been successful. And one of those areas is the role of repetition around clarifying responsibilities, clarifying what people are asked to show up to do, and it being really clear. You know it, I know it, everybody knows it, so that we can hold ourselves accountable. And there's no confusing that we can't hold each other accountable as well, because the expectations are there. And we've all bought in to say, yep, I'm here, I'm going to do that expectation. So that's what I hear from a soft skills communication perspective that a parade does, or a scrum for that matter.
Oh, absolutely. I think you've nailed it there with, clear, transparent, firm roles and responsibilities. It's the foundation for everything, right? When you get wobbly on those, when there's interpretation, when it becomes subjective, then things start to fall apart, right? So yeah, when we have a parade, people get their role and responsibilities for that shift,
Right.
right?
And to be honest, as a layperson, I would assume that they often are within a very expected range. I don't know how large of a range, but there's probably between 0 and X number of either areas of focus or particular tasks that an officer can show up and be expected to hear. Very rarely having something out of left field for that particular shift, right?
Pretty much, like it's patrol, so everybody knows they're going out for patrol and responding to calls, and dealing with traffic safety and enforcement, those type of things. But occasionally we throw something in, like foot patrol or bicycle patrol or ATV. Like those would be how far we would stretch from there, or maybe a project.
Yep.
But nothing outlandish. It all falls within the realm of what they know is normal.
And that communication that is clear and concise, these parades happen at the beginning of every shift. And so part of what I find interesting is the role of repetition when it comes to leadership, which is
Mhm.
originally our question that we're trying to work on. And there are some leaders who are remarkably adverse to repetition and feel it intimately as a weight and burdensome at some point. And then there are others who, at the other extreme, don't even acknowledge the repetition. It doesn't compute. It's what we need to do every time. It's not even calculated in that way. There's a certain connection, and I'm not sure how to describe it other than a connection of perhaps repeating what can feel like the obvious, right? To clarify roles and expectations. And to paraphrase what I heard you just say a moment ago was, you're on patrol, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it might seem obvious as a leader to say, go patrol there. And someone with a lot of tenure on the job, if they haven't had enough exposure to that leadership, repeating what could just have been assumed as, well, what you do when you show up, it doesn't become conscious. It isn't brought to the surface. That doesn't mean that people don't inherently know, well, I sort of know how to patrol. That's what I've been trained for. I get it. I'm in this unit. That's what we do. I'm not going to be, but it's that repetition and the highlighting of what might go unspoken as understood or just part of the ether that I think really build some of the leadership. Does that make any sense to you?
Like, absolutely. Like I look at parades as being the compass reset. So we're all starting from the same location, and I take advantage of it to be reminders, to be nudges for things. And I also, I use it for micro learning. It's an opportunity for us to expand at that time as well. So all related, but building on skill and building and creating new knowledge. So yeah, I love the parade part. It's a very short period of time for me to be able to have direct influence over the group of people, and then we scatter after that. But it happens every shift, right? So I can plan for what I want it to be, and I can plan for what those messages are going to be.
Absolutely. And I love that compass reset and combining that with micro learning. There's a lot there, Lorelle. There's a lot. There's a next selection that you made from our questionnaire that is actually a bunch of questions that I put together because, to be completely transparent, I was unwilling to give up on any of them. So I crammed them under the same idea. And it's in and around the idea of assertion. So that question number 15, how do you effectively assert yourself on the job as an officer? I think I'm amongst a very large proportion of the general population that wants to know, how do you do that beyond the uniform or despite the uniform, maybe? How do you assert yourself on the job?
So this one in particular is also about the gender in the uniform, right? So it's quite a complicated and complex question. Thank you for putting it in there. But it spoke to me as well, because there's a fine line between, there shouldn't be a fine line, but assertion versus aggression are, two completely separate things, but how some people, their perspective on my level of assertion, they might not be comfortable with that coming from a female, and it becomes aggression. And then we get labeled.
Yes.
Right. So similar to this, that drives me nuts, this Karen phenomenon that was going on, which is really about belittling and marginalizing females. Yep. Right. So as a female in policing, and I can tell you it's much better today than it was when I started, several years ago. It's much more acceptable to see females in leadership roles and the expectation of leaders is that they assert themselves. So assertion, again, like my rules, dignity and respect. That's what I tell my people. That's what I expect us to be to each other and to the public. And if I'm asserting myself under that framework, then that's non-aggression, right?
Right.
It also, like, for me to be effectively assertive in my role, it has to be based in honesty. It has to be direct. It has to be timely. I have to know what I'm talking about. Right. So that's the other thing. If I'm picking to be assertive about something, I really need to know what I'm talking about, or else it affects my reputation.
Lorelle, I'm reminded, I spent time earlier this week working with a group, and I teach a course that goes by several different names depending on the client, but it's essentially assertiveness and confidence, asserting with confidence, how to be confident and assert, or whatever the name goes by. But those are the concepts of confidence and assertiveness. And I've been teaching in and around those topics as long as you've been an officer, or maybe even a little bit longer, actually. And it is amazing to me, and at the same time provocative to me, that even in 2022, just the other day, and this was a virtual training that I was doing, that I get pretty much the same question that I've gotten over and over and over again. And I try and teach those concepts as a disclaimer from a best practices and what it is that you can control in terms of your output in how you interact with your immediate environment interpersonally. And I intentionally try and be as inclusive as possible because, well, as you said, it's very easy to take assertion to aggression or to passivity if we have a particular lens, whether it's cultural or gender or socioeconomic, right? There's a whole way of doing it. So I try and go to a best practices approach. Yet, despite that, over all these years, even just earlier this week, I'll get asked a question about, yeah, but how come when I assert myself as a woman, I get called something? And when men assert themselves, there's no name for that. And that
Yeah.
question hasn't evolved, which I find provocative because it's the choices underneath that are still the same. And what I always ask people to consider, because I don't know the answer to that question, it's bigger, and I only had that class for 3 hours, well beyond 3 hour scope of discussion.
Yes.
What I ask people to think about is the choices that I understand from my existence on the surface of the planet so far is, for me, I can choose to make myself small and potentially forgettable or limited in the impact that I make, or in other words, what I choose to offer and control in my output. Or there is an inherent social risk in me asserting myself in some way, and especially if I know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And the risk there is that while I may not be forgettable as I could have been if I have done nothing, that I might have other language attached to me, but I don't think I'll be forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know that's a really fundamental way of approaching that. It's my best attempt so far of being as inclusive of, the enormously broad variety of experiences that people can have with that. So the risk of being a female officer and asserting yourself, would you say that there's still that language that can be assigned to female officers that are asserting, not necessarily being aggressive, or not?
I'd like to say it's more generational. And I can say that I've seen the newer generations of officers that are joining policing. They've just not been raised that way, right?
Mm.
Females are commonplace in
Yeah.
bigger positions, right? They're prime ministers, they're presidents, they're diplomats. Like, we see it demonstrated through social media, through general media, and the exposure to that helps pave the way for others. When you see it, it becomes more commonplace. I think the older generations of police officers, it's still in there a little bit. I'd hate to paint everybody with the same brush, but it's common enough to say that it is generational. But I do see a difference. I do
That's
see it.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Your words also remind me about the importance of representation and in seeing some of ourselves in others, and the role that police officers play in our communities evolves and changes depending on the incident or non-incident and or the levels of interaction. So you mentioned representation briefly. Can I get a couple more of your thoughts on that? What is the thinking you have in terms of the significance?
It's huge. It's absolutely huge. It is I can tell you personally, for me, it's everything. Uh, I feel that I have a personality that I can move forward without seeing that demonstrated. But oh my gosh, how much easier is it when you see that somebody else has made those efforts and has moved forward. Be it, again, that you brought up the examples, be it gender, be it race, be it sexual orientation, be it even I think the socioeconomic is a thing as well. If somebody has laid that path before you, then I look at it like my kids. My youngest feels like she can do anything because she's seen my oldest accomplish. Now, my oldest had to really work hard to accomplish things because she didn't have that benefit. But my youngest thinks she can do anything, no fear, right? And that's the other thing, is that when you have that laid before you, it takes that element of fear out. And if you're lucky, you might be able to get a good mentor out of it.
Fair enough. And that fear is that social risk of perhaps having a label placed on you, and running that risk with an approach of fearlessness because you know that you are indeed on the correct path. for
Yes.
yourself, right? That's a big deal. And in
I
terms
would
of,
have
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I would have loved to see more of that in my career, but I understand where I am in the history of policing, and the trajectory that it's going is in the right direction. And I look at police services like Peel and Toronto and York, and they have very high percentages of female in their leadership, and I applaud them. It's fantastic. It makes a better organization, right?
Absolutely. And the whole idea of this podcast is to make some better conversations on the surface of the planet around how people do what it is they do and how it relates to soft skills. And Lorelle, you absolutely have contributed to that. So thank you so much for being a part of this and for sharing your thoughts with all our listeners.
Oh, such a pleasure to spend any time with you, Diana. So thank you too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to another dynamic and informative episode of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Please consider subscribing to our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we also encourage you to visit our website and social media links, which you can find in the show's notes. We look forward to bringing you another episode. And remember, conversation is the currency of communication. Bye for now.